In the heat of the Levant, the air around Jerusalem carried dust, sweat, and the sharp bite of iron from armor and tools. The year is 1099. After years of preaching and months of marching, a Western army arrives at the walls of a city that mattered deeply to many faiths. They called themselves pilgrims under arms. Later generations called them Crusaders. For the people looking down from the battlements, Muslims, Yevs, and Eastern Christians, they were strangers at the gate, convinced that heaven had singled them out, and determined to take what they believed was owed to God. In that certainty, you can already hear the danger once a cause is declared sacred. Restraint starts to feel like betrayal. Many were motivated by a mix of devotion, adventure, social pressure, and the promise of spiritual reward. And many were also driven by very human hopes for land, status, and security. Welcome to Medieval Spirits. If you enjoy clear history told with respect for the people who lived it, please like the video, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. The Crusades are often retold as a romance of brave knights and sacred vows. But the record is far more complicated. Tonight, we will look at moments where ideals collapsed under strain, where hunger, exhaustion, revenge, and ambition pushed people beyond limits they never expected to cross. We will also keep an eye on the sources, because medieval chroniclers wrote with emotion, agenda, and pride, and they do not always agree on details. We will move from Jerusalem back to earlier turning points like Antioch and Ma'arat, and forward to Constantinople, to see how the same machinery of belief and power produced different kinds of tragedy. Across the medieval world, the Crusades reshaped politics, trade, and memory for centuries. They created new states, new rivalries, and new stories that families repeated at the dinner table. They also hardened stereotypes and fears, making it easier for communities to see each other as permanent enemies. When conflict is framed as sacred, opponents are easily labeled as less than human, and that makes violence feel normal, even praiseworthy. Our goal is not to chant for a side. Our goal is to understand what happened, why it happened, and what it cost the ordinary people whose names rarely appear in chronicles, even though they carried most of the suffering. The Crusades also increased contact between regions, spreading ideas and goods. But that contact often arrived through violence first, leaving suspicion that outlasted any commercial benefit. In July 1099, after a hard campaign across the Levant, the Crusader army reached Jerusalem, then held by the Fatimid Caliphate. For many in the army, this was the goal that had justified years of sacrifice, debt, and separation from home. The siege was intense and urgent, shaped by limited supplies and the fear that relief forces might arrive. Once the attackers breached the defenses, the fighting inside the city became chaotic and deadly. Medieval writers used vivid language, and modern historians debate the numbers. But the core reality is clear: many people were killed, and not only those carrying weapons. Siege towers, ladders, and improvised engines mattered, but so did thirst and morale. Because an army cannot wait forever under a summer sun, Western chroniclers such as Raymond of Aguilar's and Fulcher of Shard described the capture in spiritual terms, presenting it as purification and fulfillment. Muslim and Jewish sources describe panic, flight, and grief. It is important to say this plainly but carefully. Violence was not limited to armed defenders. Many civilians were caught in the sweep of conquest as neighborhoods and sacred spaces were overrun. Some were killed in confusion, some while fleeing, and some in places where they believed they would be protected. Whatever number you accept, the human effect is not abstract. Families lost loved ones, communities lost homes, and a sacred city became a scene of trauma remembered for generations. Some famous descriptions may be exaggerated for effect. Yet the broad picture of widespread killing is supported by the convergence of multiple traditions that rarely agree on anything else. To understand why this happened, we have to imagine the attacker's condition. Many were hungry, sick, and hardened by months of siege warfare. Some believed victory proved divine approval, which can be a dangerous idea when mixed with exhaustion and anger. Leaders may have wanted order, but soldiers on the ground acted in minutes, not in speeches. Once discipline broke, stopping violence became difficult, and sometimes unpopular among those who felt entitled to reward. Jerusalem became a grim example of how quickly military success can turn into moral collapse when opponents are treated as obstacles rather than human beings. In later years, even some Christian writers tried to frame the event as necessary, which is itself revealing of how easy it is to turn suffering into a story of righteousness once the outcome is secure. Long before Jerusalem, the First Crusade had already been marked by severe hardship and harsh choices. In the winter of 1098, the army reached Ma'arat al-Numan in Syria. The region had been stripped by war. Supplies were scarce, and the Crusaders were desperate for food. After the city fell, violence followed as it often did in medieval sieges, and the army lingered in a place that could not feed it. Hunger and disorder spread through the camp, and leaders struggled to keep control over a force made up of nobles, soldiers, and non-combatants who had followed the expedition for hope, profit, or salvation. This was the underside of crusading logistics. Supply lines failed, local harvests were depleted, and the army became dependent on whatever could be seized, traded for, or taken by force. A darker story appears in multiple sources from both Christian and Muslim perspectives. Allegations that a small number of crusaders, driven by extreme starvation, committed cannibalism. Christian writers such as Radulf of Cain mention it, and later Muslim chroniclers, including Ibn al-Athir, repeat the claim. Modern historians debate details and scale, and it is possible that some accounts were amplified to shock audiences, to frighten enemies, or to stigmatize particular factions within the Crusader camp. Even with caution, the episode matters as a signal of desperation so intense that it shattered a powerful taboo. It is not a story to sensationalize, but a reminder of what famine can do to human judgment. If the accounts are true, even in limited form, they show how quickly a movement that preached salvation could become at its edges. A community of survivors willing to do almost anything. Whether rare or not, the Ma'arat story mattered because of its psychological impact. It traveled as a warning these invaders were not only dangerous in battle, they were unpredictable under pressure. It also shows how starvation can collapse rules that feel unbreakable, turning faith into survival instinct. If we want to understand the Crusades honestly, We can not only count victories and castles, we also have to face how quickly human beings can lose their moral footing when fear and hunger crowd out empathy. In that sense, Ma'arat is less a legend about monsters and more a case study in what happens when an army becomes a moving famine. It also shows why reputations matter in war once an army is believed capable of the unthinkable. Enemies negotiate differently, resist differently, and sometimes preemptively strike out of fear. Not all violence tied to the crusading movement happened in the Middle East. In 1096, as armed groups moved through the Rhineland on the way east, several Jewish communities were attacked. Jewish sources, including Solomon Bar Simpson, describe terror, forced baptisms, and killings. Christian sources and later historians also acknowledge these events, though motives and responsibility varied across groups and leaders. This was not one unified plan with a single commander. It was a wave of violence in which religious enthusiasm, debt, local resentments, and rumor combined into catastrophe for neighbors who had lived side by side for years. The tragedy also demonstrates how crusading rhetoric could be redirected, turning a distant campaign into a license for local violence when social restraints were already under stress. These attacks remind us that the Crusades changed the atmosphere in Europe itself. Some people began to treat local minorities as enemies, arguing that fighting for God required purging anyone labeled as an outsider. Church leaders did not consistently support such actions, and some bishops tried to shelter threatened communities. But condemnation in theory did not always prevent tragedy in practice. Crowds are hard to stop once they believe their anger is righteous, especially when local authorities fear the mob or hope to benefit from seized property. For the victims, the choice often presented was impossible: abandon identity, flee, or D. The lasting legacy was not only loss of life, but shattered trust, and a lesson that sacred slogans can be turned against the innocent. For older viewers today, the pattern may feel familiar when public fear spikes. Conspiracy stories spread fast, and people with little power become convenient targets. In the Eastern Mediterranean, coercion also appeared in certain local contexts after sieges. Though the picture is mixed, some commanders negotiated terms, some protected populations for practical reasons, and some punished harshly. The point is not to claim every crusader behaved the same way, or that every city experienced the same fate. The point is that religious certainty sometimes provided cover for coercion, and the people caught in the middle paid the price in fear, displacement, and fractured identity. When belief becomes a tool of policy, it is the vulnerable who feel it first. And the scars left by forced choices can last far longer than the campaigns that produced them. Remembering this complexity does not excuse anyone, but it helps us see how institutions and incentives shape behavior, and how quickly moral language can be repurposed into control. The crusading ideal did not stay focused on Jerusalem. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade reached a turning point that shocked many contemporaries. Instead of sailing to fight in Muslim-controlled lands, the Crusader army became entangled in debt to Venice and in Byzantine political conflict. They arrived at Constantinople, the wealthiest Christian city in the Eastern Mediterranean, and became involved in a struggle over the imperial throne. Promises were made, payments were delayed, and trust collapsed. What began as a diverted expedition turned into a crisis where military force became a bargaining chip, and then an excuse for conquest. Along the way, the Crusaders attacked other targets to settle debts and secure ships, and each compromise made it easier to justify the next one. In April Omiadowa Sutapatru, the Crusaders breached the city's defenses and the sack began. Byzantine historian Niketas Choniates described looting, destruction, and humiliation in churches and palaces. Western sources also record the seizure of relics, treasure, and art. Sacred buildings were violated. Manuscripts were scattered, and ordinary families were left vulnerable in the streets. It is hard to overstate the cultural loss. Objects that carried centuries of memory were taken, sold, or melted down. Even those who believed they were serving Christ could not easily explain why Christians were being robbed and harmed by men wearing crosses. Choniates wrote with anguish, and Western accounts sometimes sound more matter-of-fact. But both point to the same core fact: a Christian city was treated as spoil, not as a community of fellow believers. The long-term damage was enormous. The Latin Empire that followed was unstable, and Byzantium never fully recovered its strength. Distrust between Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic worlds deepened, making later cooperation harder. Even when leaders tried to rebuild relationships, memories of 1204 remained vivid and bitter, passed down through sermons, stories, and political grievances. The sack of Constantinople is a reminder that once an army is trained to see taking as virtue, the target can change quickly. A crusade that began as a promise to defend Christians ended with Christians harming Christians, and the wound lasted for centuries. In a larger sense, 1204 shows how a holy project can be captured by economic structures, turning faith into branding while decisions are made by accountants, diplomats, and commanders. Before Jerusalem was ever reached, the First Crusade was nearly broken at Antioch. From late 1097 into 1098, the Crusaders besieged the city for months. Food ran out, disease spread, and morale cracked. Chroniclers described people eating anything they could find, selling equipment, and abandoning the army. Antioch shows how medieval warfare was not only about heroic charges, it was about logistics, weather, and endurance. And those factors often shaped behavior more than ideals did. When hunger controls the day, even the most confident slogans can start to sound hollow. Letters and chronicles describe a camp filled with argument and despair, where promises of heaven competed with the very real possibility of dying anonymously outside foreign walls. When the city was finally taken through betrayal from within, the attackers surged in with fury and relief. In many medieval conquests, including those carried out by Muslim and Christian forces, a captured city could suffer a period of uncontrolled violence, especially in the first hours when panic and revenge dominated. Antioch was no exception. Killings occurred during the chaos, and residents who had survived the siege now faced uncertainty about who would be spared and who would be targeted. The lines between soldier and civilian blurred in narrow streets where everyone looked like a threat in the dark. It is an uncomfortable truth, but a necessary one. Prolonged suffering does not always produce mercy. It often produces rage. When we hear about massacres, it can be tempting to imagine a single order, but in many cases it was the breakdown of command, combined with opportunism, that created the worst outcomes. Then, almost immediately, the Crusaders themselves became trapped. A relief army arrived, and the besiegers became the besieged. In that crisis, certainty became fragile. Some looked for miracles. Others blamed leaders. And others tried to flee. Antioch shows a central truth of the Crusades' faith could inspire endurance. But it did not replace food, water, and stability. When those basics vanished, people made choices they later wrapped in holy language. Even when the real cause was desperation. The lesson is not that belief is meaningless, but that belief can be distorted when survival and power are on the line. Stories of visions and relics, including accounts of a miraculous lance, helped some regain confidence. And that tells us something about how belief can function as emotional fuel in a crisis. Taken together, these episodes show why the Crusades cannot be reduced to a simple tale of heroes or villains. There were moments of courage, negotiation, and cooperation. And there were moments of cruelty, greed, and loss of control. The phrase, "God wills," it could encourage people to keep walking when they wanted to collapse. But it could also silence doubt. When someone believes heaven is on their side, it becomes easier to treat opponents as less than human, and easier to excuse actions that would normally feel shameful. That is why the most dangerous words in a conflict are often the ones that claim certainty. They can turn complicated human beings into symbols, and symbols are easy to destroy. For a 50-plus audience, one of the most striking themes is how quickly institutions can normalize what individuals might otherwise reject, especially when everyone around them says it is necessary. For societies in the Middle East, the arrival of the Franks was often remembered as invasion and disruption. For many in Europe, the Crusades became a story of identity and legend. Those memories did not match, and that mismatch shaped later diplomacy, trade, and conflict. Even the architecture left behind, fortresses, walls, rebuilt ports, and scarred cities, carries the imprint of a world that learned to expect sudden war. The stones still stand, but they cannot tell us the names of the farmers, merchants, and children who lived in the shadow of these walls, adapting their lives to danger they did not choose. When we look at ruins, we should also imagine the kitchens, the workshops, and the neighborhoods that once surrounded them. These competing memories later shaped how each side interpreted diplomacy, trade, and even pilgrimage, because every new encounter carried the shadow of earlier betrayal or massacre. So, here is the question for us today. What happens when sacred purpose is tied to political power? Can a war ever be truly holy if it depends on the suffering of innocents? Share your thoughts in the comments. We can study the Crusades with honesty and compassion, recognizing complexity while still naming harm. When we do that, history becomes more than drama. It becomes a lesson about how certainty can become permission, and how important it is, in any age, to protect empathy when fear is loudest and leaders benefit from division. If we can hold two truths at once, that people can be sincere and still do harm, we become less vulnerable to propaganda that demands simple heroes and simple enemies. The Crusades did not end with one treaty or one final battle. They faded through shifting alliances, changing rulers, and new priorities. But the language and memory remained. Words like crusade and jihad still appear in modern speech, sometimes used carelessly, as if centuries of pain were just a metaphor. Studying the past does not mean reliving it, but it does mean understanding how old stories can be reused to inflame new conflicts or to paint entire peoples with one broad brush. If we want less hatred in the present, we need more precision about the past. That begins by admitting that human beings on every side were capable of devotion, fear, generosity, and cruelty. That precision means separating medieval actors from modern communities and refusing to treat any faith or culture as a single character in a story. When we read medieval sources, we also need humility. Chroniclers wrote to praise patrons, defend faith, or condemn enemies. They exaggerated, are selected details that served their message, and used vivid images to persuade. That does not mean we ignore them. It means we read them carefully, compare perspectives, and remember that behind every description were real families, real streets, and real losses. The most important voices are often the hardest to hear because ordinary people left fewer records, and because later storytellers preferred heroes and villains to neighbors trying to survive. A responsible telling tries to honor that silence by focusing on what war does to daily life hunger. Flight, ruined markets, broken families, and the long work of rebuilding trust. If you want more thoughtful, balanced history with medieval spirits, please like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. The Crusades show us the best and worst of human capability, endurance, devotion, imagination, but also prejudice and cruelty when systems reward it. In the end, the most valuable thing we can take from this story is not a slogan or a side to cheer for. It is a clearer sense of how easily conviction can become a weapon, and how necessary it is to guard our shared humanity. The past is not asking us to hate, it is asking us to learn, so that the next time certainty shows up with a sword, we recognize the warning signs. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep your compassion close, because history is at its best when it makes us wiser, not colder.